Welcome. Grab your favorite morning beverage and join us for Morning Canollis with Jim Santel.
You don't know me, but I'm your brother.
Sampling the news desserts of the week, here is your host, Jim Santel.
Good morning on this Saturday, September 9th, 2023. My name is Jim Santel, and yes, indeed, this is Morning Canollis. This, as always, is our weekly review, our analysis, and our discussion with you of the most important news stories and events of the past week, sometimes even beyond the past week. Focusing on law, government, and the aspiration for justice in America. We're here in this 9 o'clock hour and also in the 10 o'clock hour in the studios of Civic Media here in downtown Waukesha. I am joined in this studio by my ever-faithful, highly professional and focused producer. Her name is Anya, and together, we're going to be taking your phone calls and also your texts here through the Civic Media processes to pursue our discussions this morning in all of these various areas. This morning, as always, we have an ambitious but achievable agenda. This, as always, a time for asking some three important questions. What happened during the course of the past week? What are these events that are animating our lives? What do we know about them? What are the facts? Why are they important? Why are they relevant? Why are they material, significant to the understanding of our lives and the livelihoods that we pursue here in America and right here in the state of Wisconsin? And finally, what do we do about those things? What kinds of actions should we take? What are responses, our answers? What kinds of things should we pursue in response to those things that we know, the important things in our lives? And that is the springboard for the first portion of our program this morning. As always, taking your phone calls at 844-967-2789, and also your texts, your communications with Anya and me through text. Go to Civic Media, identify your particular radio station, identify Morning Canollis, and send us your messages, your comments, your questions there as well. All of that, our solicitation to you of this conversation this morning, this hour, and next hour, predicated upon the notion that through discussion and examination, understanding and development, academic and also perspectives on our lives, we can be better people in our state and in our nation. In the past 61 broadcasts, and yes, indeed, this is our 62nd broadcast on the services of Civic Media. In virtually all of those, we have had some wonderful callers, some folks who are calling in to provide information about relevant things in their lives, but also perspectives on the ways in which we together are citizens of this country and residents of this planet. Last week in particular, some tremendously helpful, thoughtful, and focused comments about the focus on what we do in America, that third question that we often ask here on Morning Canollis. What are we supposed to do about those things? And there was one caller in particular. His name is Danny, and he was asking me in particular about what it is we do to ensure that we have candidates for office. We've got folks in appointed and elective office who are truly qualified for those positions. What kinds of things can we as Americans do to ensure that the people who are representing us in government, again, both appointed and elected, and in other civil service positions, the people who serve us on a day-to-day basis are qualified for those positions? And my response at the time was not only to invoke the Constitution of the United States of America with respect to the presidency of the United States of America, but also begin to talk about the other things that we can do as Americans, and offered to Danny and to others listening at the end of our second hour last Saturday, begin to talk about the ways in which we as citizens can engage in our communities to ensure that the people who are in fact representing us are those folks who truly do just that, committed to it, do that work through their intellectualism, their industry, their focus, their humanity, and their diplomacy. Again, their articulate ways of describing their missions, their views, their perspectives on the world. One of the ways which that can happen, of course, is to engage in the political process. Becoming involved in politics is an important aspect, if in fact you're inclined to do that. Showing up at meetings of elected representatives, sometimes even appointed representatives in our communities, asking asking them questions about the important things going on in our communities, becoming involved in political parties again, if you are inclined to do that, by virtue of the things that they do to select candidates, and ensuring that as a part of that process, you've got folks who are truly among those people who should be truly representative of our nation, of our state, of our communities, asking them the specific questions about what qualifies them to serve in those positions. A lot of those political things are virtually critically important to the future of our nation. They're not necessarily in our Constitution, not necessarily in our statutes, but they're the predicates or the bases upon which we get those folks into office, and so incredibly important to become involved in that exploration of the ways in which people become elective officers and also are appointed to these various positions. That's one of the ways in which you can, of course, engage in that kind of activity. The other one, of course, is voting. An all-important issue which we talk about on a regular basis here on Morning Canollis. And that leads into the first item on our very extensive syllabus this morning, having to do with voting. And something that happened just this past week in the area of voting rights and the Voting Rights Act in particular. We have chatted a lot in the past about a case called Allen versus Milligan. Allen versus Milligan, a Supreme Court case coming out of the United States Supreme Court just this past June, on June 8th. A decision by the United States Supreme Court under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act coming out of the state of Alabama. The predicates for that, the factual basis for that again, this notion that representatives in the state legislatures should be drawing lines following every single census that's taken every 10 years that are truly representative to ensure that people who are elected to those offices, specifically congressional offices, but also state offices, to assembly and Senate offices in the particular states, that those lines are drawn in ways that are truly ensuring that the franchise, the right to vote, is guaranteed to every single person in that state. And in Allen versus Milligan, the population, of course, in the state of Alabama, about 28% or so of the population in Alabama are people of color, black residents in particular, those folks who are responsible, of course, along with all members of the residents of the state of Alabama, for ensuring that they elect to offices, both federal and state, people who are truly representative of them. And what happened was that the state legislature, you may recall, in Alabama, made some decisions, did some line drawing, again, in connection with its obligatory responsibility to draw those lines back in 2021 and 2022. And they did so in a way that basically disenfranchised a significant portion of that 28% of the population, people of color in Alabama. The case went up to the United States Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, to a surprise to many of us, that under the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of the 1960s, that the state of Alabama, the legislature in particular, had indeed violated the law and was, by virtue of the line drawing that it had done, kept representatives from being elected to districts in Alabama that could, in fact, be majority black districts. In particular, the Supreme Court, a majority of the Supreme Court, including Brett Kavanaugh and John Roberts, said that the Alabama legislature's got to go back and do that again, got to do it over to ensure that that 28% and perhaps more people in the state of Alabama are truly represented by virtue of the ways in which the lines are drawn, the opportunities to elect from at least is what the Supreme Court said, two majority black districts that could indeed represent more directly and accurately the population of the state of Alabama. State of Alabama then, back in July of this year, went back and did that examination, reconsidered the line drawing that it had done a couple of years or so earlier, and surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, came back and said, we're not going to do what the United States Supreme Court has told us to do. They, instead of identifying two majority black districts that should indeed represent the population, the entire population of the state of Alabama, including people of color, the legislature in Alabama came back and said, no, we're only going to identify one of those. And they justified that. They justified that, or attempted to do so, on the basis that the lower court decision had some wiggle room, they said, in connection with the language that was the prescriptive aspect of this, telling them what to do. And this came back again to the three-judge panel in the Southern District of Alabama, looking over all of this, again, in the wake of the Supreme Court decision, telling the legislature to redo their maps. The legislature basically saying, we're not doing that. We're not doing what the Supreme Court has said. And that then prompts the review of the most recent non-decision, non-compliance by the legislature, by this three-judge panel in the Northern District of Alabama, the Southern Division of that district. And those judges are Judge Marcus, Circuit Court Judge Marcus, Judge Manasco, and Judge Moore. All of those last two are district court judges. This is a three-judge panel, again, under the civil rights laws and the Voting Rights Act in particular, reviewing what the legislature has done for a second, arguably a third time in this case. And what did this particular three-judge panel do just this past week? Just this past week, in one of the major decisions of our time, said the Supreme Court is indeed the Supreme Court. You need to follow what the Supreme Court has said. The court, in a 217-page opinion, went through all of the history in this case and described again the fact that the initial lawsuit here alleged that there was racial gerrymandering in violation of the Constitution, and in particular in violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And in this omnibus 217-page order of just this past Tuesday, the three-judge panel coming out of the Northern District of Alabama, the Southern Division there, said that the decision by the legislature in Alabama could indeed not be supported by what the Supreme Court had said and what the three-judge panel had previously said that because federal law dictates that the Alabama legislature should have the first opportunity to draw a remedial map, we gave the legislature that opportunity. That opportunity has now come and gone, noting in particular in this order of just this past Tuesday, on July 21, the legislature enacted, and Governor Ivey, the governor of Alabama, signed into law a new congressional map. But just like the 21 plan that had been the subject of the challenge to the Supreme Court, enjoined by this court, stopped by the court, the plan includes only one majority black district, and that's the basis upon which the three-judge panel once again said you're not in compliance with the Supreme Court. When we come back after this first break, we're going to talk more about this all-important case coming out of this three-judge panel, coming out of Alabama, that describes once again what it means to vote in America, important for all of us. Stay with us for that discussion. We are back this morning on Morning Canollis. It is Saturday, September 9th, 2023. Thank you once again for joining me this hour, and hopefully next hour as well, as we talk through a great variety of events, circumstances, news items coming out of government law and the aspiration for justice in America. Right before the break, began our discussion this morning with this all-important decision of this past Tuesday, coming out of a three-judge panel in Alabama, finding for at least a second time that the Alabama legislature had indeed violated Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act by drawing lines with respect to the federal representation and also state representation in that state, basically disenfranchising at least 28% of the population, people of color in that state. The decision by this three-judge panel saying, number one, that you need to follow what the Supreme Court has said. The Supreme Court spoke about this in June, finding again that there had been a violation of the law, telling the legislature to do exactly what the law required. Legislature coming back and saying, we're not doing, Supreme Court, what you told us to do. Now this three-judge panel say, oh yes, indeed, you will do that. And we'll get to the remedy that the three-judge panel imposed in just a moment or so. Along Along the way, the three-judge panel says this to the legislature, putting it in its place, but also saying unequivocally that the record before us is complete. Before the three-judge panel, it includes evidentiary materials submitted during the injunctive proceedings that predated all of this, also expert reports, deposition transcripts, and other evidence submitted during this remedial or curative stage, if you will. We also have the benefit, the court says, of the parties' briefs, a hearing, 3 amicus briefs, that is, briefs submitted by parties to the court, parties who are not friends of the court, people who are not parties formally, but nonetheless who are involved in the issue in some way, and also a statement of interest by, yes, indeed, the Attorney General of the United States of America, his name, of course, Merrick Garland. The state, the panel's decision says, concedes that the 2023 plan, this most recent plan, does not include the additional district that is required by the Supreme Court. Indeed, the state has explained that its position is that notwithstanding our order and the Supreme Court's order as well, the legislature was not required to include that additional district in its 2023 plan. And here's where the language becomes all important. The court goes on to say this concession by the legislature that we're not doing what the Supreme Court told us to do controls this case. Court goes on to say this, because the 2023 plan does not include an additional district of the sort described by the Supreme Court and previously by this court, we conclude that the 2023 plan does not remedy the Section 2 violation that we found and the Supreme Court affirmed. We also conclude, under the controlling Supreme Court test, that the plaintiffs here are substantially likely to establish that this plan violates Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Under that act, the three-judge panel says, the statutory framework and binding precedent, the appropriate remedy is, as we already said, a congressional districting plan that includes either an additional majority black district or some additional district in which black voters have an opportunity to elect a representative truly of their choice. It goes on to say this, we discern no basis in federal law to accept a map the state admits falls short of this required remedy. And so what does the court do? What does this three-judge panel do? It's not going to send it back to the legislature. They've had 2 opportunities already to abide by the rule of law and have decided not to do that. The court says this, based on the evidence before us, including the testimony from the legislators, we have no reason to believe that allowing the legislature still another opportunity to draw yet another map will yield a map that includes an additional district of the sort described by the previous orders. Moreover, counsel for the state, that is the legislature, has informed the court that even if the court were to grant the legislature yet another opportunity to draw that map, it would be practically impossible for the legislature to do that in advance of the 2024 election cycle. In other words, time has now run up. And so the court says this, because we grant relief on statutory grounds and a fundamental and long-standing principle of judicial restraint requires that we avoid reaching constitutional questions in advance of deciding them, we are reserving the constitutional issues raised by various cases and positions, and instead doing this. We have reached the conclusion, these conclusions in our order, that after conducting this exhaustive analysis of an extensive record under well-developed legal standards, as the Supreme Court instructs, we do not take lightly, the court goes on to say, federal intrusion into a process ordinarily reserved for the state legislature. But we have now said twice that the Voting Rights Act case, this one, is not close. And indeed, that's what the Supreme Court had said as well in its decision of back in June, finding that there had been a history, a very virulent history of discrimination in voting rights in Alabama. And then goes on to say this, which is a part of the media attention to this all-important decision of this earlier this week. The court goes on to say, we are deeply troubled that the state enacted a map that the state readily admits does not provide the remedy we said federal law requires. We are disturbed by the evidence that the state delayed remedial proceedings, but ultimately did not even nurture the ambition to provide the required remedy. And we are struck by the extraordinary circumstances we face. We are not aware, this three-judge panel goes on to say, of any other case in which a state legislature faced with a federal court order declaring that its electoral plan unlawfully dilutes minority votes and requiring a plan that provides an additional district, responded with a plan that the state concedes does not provide that district. The law requires the creation of that additional district that affords black Alabamians, like everyone else, a fair and reasonable opportunity to elect candidates of their choice. The plan, advanced, articulated, voted on, and approved by the governor, plainly does not do so. That's strong language coming out of any court, including a 3-judge panel convened to enforce the Voting Rights Act of the 1960s. We're going to talk more about the reason why this is so important for us here in Wisconsin, why it's so important for everyone in our nation to understand what's going on there in Alabama and what it says about the future of the enforcement of voting rights here in America and right here in the state of Wisconsin. Stay with us for that discussion right after this next break.
That it's pretty up there. We can go hiking on Tuesday. With you I'd walk anywhere. California has worn me quite thin. I just can't wait to see you again. Come Monday, it'll be alright. Come Monday, I'll be holding you tight. Tried to amend my carnivorous.
We are back here on Morning Canollis, Saturday, September 9th, 2023. Thank you for joining me in this discussion initially this morning of a major decision in the enforcement of the rule of law in support of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This 3-judge panel in Alabama telling the Alabama legislature that it cannot simply disregard the rulings, the directives of the Supreme Court, and making the decision in the end because they've had 2 opportunities already to do that and affirmatively chose not to follow the rule of law, that now this 3-judge panel appointing what's called a special master and sort of a friend of the court in a different way, who's going to take on the responsibility for doing what the legislature has not done, namely to draw these lines in Alabama in a way that is consistent with federal law. The opinion by the 3-judge panel says this: the special master and the cartographer, the map designer, the drawer, if you will, are directed to commence work forthwith on that remedial plan, and instructions on what they're supposed to do will follow this order. In other words, we're going to direct these people as the frontline workers on behalf of this 3-judge panel to do what the legislature did not. We're going to ask them, we're going to direct them to put together lines which will then be imposed upon the legislature, the governor, and everyone in Alabama to ensure that voting rights are supported. Raises the issue then down the road, once that is done, presumably fairly quickly. What happens then? Well, it's got the enforcement now both at the Supreme Court and by this 3-judge panel. One would hope that no one would pursue additional attempts to undermine what the Supreme Court has said, what the law says in the state of Alabama and nationwide, and that these would be the lines finally, that would be appropriately imposed upon the residents and the clerks and all the voters in the state of Alabama to ensure that that population of African-American voters, black voters in Alabama gets the representation that it deserves under the law. As we well know, Alabama has had a history of non-compliance, of thwarting what the federal government has said in the past. Recall well that in the 1954 decision, Brown versus Board of Education, state of Alabama basically said, nope, we're not, in fact, going to segregate, we're not desegregate schools. We're going to continue segregating black and white schools, the public schools there in Alabama. George Wallace notoriously promising segregation forever. And it was only after the Supreme Court entered a second order called Brown versus Board of Education 2. And yes, indeed, there was some specific enforcement by the Attorney General at the time, by the President, who directed that law enforcement authorities ensure that segregation is brought to an end in Alabama, that we moved toward that remedial end. There has been that history. We will see what happens here again in the area of enforcement of civil rights. That's why this is so important, not only to Alabama, not only to our nation, but also right here in the state of Wisconsin. We have got our own voting issues, both historically and presently. The rule of law this past week has prevailed, has told us unequivocally that it means something when courts direct you to engage in activities that ensure voting is complete for all your residents, all the people who are entitled to vote in the particular state. Voting is meaningful, it has power, it has impact, and that's what the decision this past week reaffirms for all of us. Significantly, going over to Florida, another decision, sending the same kinds of messages to all of us. This one coming out of a circuit court judge, a state judge named Lee Marsh, and he is finding that the governor-approved map that again did the same thing, a congressional map in Florida, likewise violates the state constitution, according to the Judge Marsh, diminishing the ability of black voters in North Florida to elect representatives of their choice. And he there orders the legislature to draw a new one. So he's going back, he's saying, okay, legislature, I will give you a second opportunity to do the right thing. Again, a real affirmation of voting rights under the law and also there in Florida. The new map, which was drawn last year, basically had erased a congressional seat for a district where about 46% of voting age residents were black. Basically erased that off of the map entirely. And Al Lawson, who was a black Democrat, represented that district and promptly lost re-election in that newly drawn seat. Perhaps the best evidence of all of the invidious purpose behind doing this line drawing in the way that the legislature did. A circuit court judge there in Florida this past week saying, nope, can't do that. The Voting Rights Act requires more. The state constitution requires more. Do what you are supposed to do and ensure that voting is provided and opportunities to vote afforded to all members of our state. So two significant decisions in the area of voting rights. Important to understand not only the meaning of those as we talk generally about the rule of law in America. Other major issues of just this past week, a lot of this in the news. We're going to get to it in the remainder of this hour and also in the future. We had a major decision coming out of a federal district court in Washington, D.C., imposing a significant sentence on a fellow named Enrique Terrio, again, who is the head of the Proud Boys. We're going to talk about that, the meaning, the significance of that extraordinary 22-year sentence imposed upon him for seditious conspiracy engaging in January 6th. And in connection with January 6th, we're going to revisit right now the indictment coming out of Fulton County, Georgia, brought by Fani Willis, who is the DA there, against 19 different individuals for attempting to, not successfully, but attempting to undermine the vote there, to skew the Electoral College vote there, to somehow compromise what legitimate people did in voting and then getting those votes counted in the state of Georgia. We know well, based upon the indictment that we have chatted about in the past, a state court indictment, that 19 different people charged with various charges, including RICO, a racketeer influenced and corrupt organization allegation against these 19 people, 41 counts altogether in that indictment, including influencing witnesses, election fraud, defrauding the state, computer tampering, falsifying documents, forgery, all kinds of things, again, that we have chatted about before. Among the defendants, among the 19 defendants, is a fellow named Mark Meadows. We know that well. Mark Meadows, the former chief of staff of the White House under the Trump administration. And according to that indictment brought by the indicting grand jury in the state of Georgia not too long ago, Mark Meadows, among the people responsible for this RICO event, this RICO movement to try to stop the proper counting and the proper allocation, if you will, even of voting rights in Georgia that undermined or attempted to undermine the result there. We know in particular that Mark Meadows, as a part of his testimony recently in a federal court there, had testified that Donald Trump directed him to set up that now famous phone call on January 2nd of 2021 between Donald Trump and Brad Raffensperger, who was the Georgia Secretary of State at the time. You may recall well that was the call in which the former president said, I need about 12,000 more votes, just enough votes to ensure that I get the electoral votes coming out of the state of Georgia. Meadows testified during the course of a recent hearing in federal court that was one of the things that he did at the request of the former president. He also testified that he had visited a place called Cobb County, Georgia, where a ballot audit was then taking place. And he went down there, apparently, again, at the encouragement of the former president, to try to determine whether or not some election fraud claims were supported. And he indicated during the course of his testimony that he wasn't permitted to go in, wasn't permitted to do that, but plainly reached out to some authorities there to try to, in some way, influence that process as well. And there's more in the indictment against him. Why is this all significant? Well, this past week, again, a major decision, again, enforcing the rule of law, this time again in Georgia, with respect to where that particular indictment as to Mark Meadows is going to be tried. Mark Meadows, in a series of motions filed through his attorneys prior to the hearing of a couple of weeks or so ago, recent days, and specifically before a major decision issued by a federal district court judge just this past week, this major decision on the Mark Meadows petition. What was that petition all about? It was to try to get the state prosecution moved from Fulton County, again, the state venue there, into federal court. And the premise for that decision, that movement, if you will, that decision to petition the court to do that, was that these things that Mark Meadows did at the behest of the former president of the United States of America were things done, wait for it, in the context of his duties and responsibilities as the chief of staff of the White House at the time, things that are required of him by virtue of his appointment to this important spot. Now, we know it very well based upon our previous discussions that there is, in fact, a statute, Section 1442, we've talked about a lot, that says, you know what, if you are a federal official and you are charged in state court by individuals who led to civil rights violations, other violations of the law, and it is clear that the activities, the events, the circumstances that prompted that state court lawsuit are premised upon things that you did in the course of your duties and your responsibilities as a federal employee, appointed, elected, and otherwise involved in the service to America. If those kinds of things are indeed a part of the assignments given to you in that official capacity, there's a process for removing that, changing the venue, moving it from state court to federal court, and getting the federal court to oversee the prosecution, the litigation of the particular claims against you. There are also things in the Federal Tort Claims Act, other things that require substitution that go beyond what this particular case invokes. But the notion is that there is that process. The premise of it, once again, is you've got to be able to establish that your petition, your motion to the federal judge to get that case removed is based upon the notion that what you did, whatever it was that you allegedly engaged in, that was done by virtue of the assignment given to you by the people, whether through the elective process, the appointed process, to do something in your duties and responsibilities, color of law. And here, let me offer this perspective, which I advanced last week as well, that the position taken by Mark Meadows in petitioning the court for this removal is absolutely absurd. There is no there. This is not a close question at all. And then the federal district court judge appropriately listened to all this testimony, accepted the motion as he is required to do, listened to the testimony, gave some consideration to it, and yes, just this past week, found unequivocally, as Judge Jones, Stephen Jones of the Northern District of Georgia found, he said there's no federal jurisdiction over this criminal case. The outcome of this case will be for a Fulton County, a state court judge, and trier of fact to ultimately decide. He rejected out of hand, in a very lengthy opinion, going through all the statements, all the positions articulated, advanced by Mark Meadows in oral statements and then in written presentations to him, rejected all of them, finding once again that the activities in which he engaged were certainly not those kinds of things you would contemplate would be assigned to a federal employee in the course of their regular duties and responsibilities. Specifically, Judge Jones found that much of this was campaign-related in nature, political in nature, not a part of your normal assignments as a federal officer. Also indicated more than around the edges that the allegations in any event are not only that these are campaign events, but they may have been illegal. And certainly under the statute, under federal law, the notion that you somehow get to remove allegations of criminal activity not done in the course of your duties and responsibilities from a state court to a federal court, that would be your position is absurd. And one of the reasons why this is important, number one, is not only for the conclusion which Judge Jones comes to in this expansive decision, excellent to read, understandable, accessible, not only around the edges, but right in the middle of its core meanings and import. Significant not only to ensure that this case remains where it should, which is prosecution of state offenses in state court, but also does a couple other things. Number one is it sends messages to others among the 19 also charged by Fani Willis that unlikely that their cases will receive this any better receipt, any better reception by a federal district court judge. Mark Meadows arguably had the best case of all, and it wasn't very strong at all. When we come back after this break, I'm going to talk more about why this is significant. Mark Meadows, other defendants, and more broadly, the focus on all of us on understanding what's really going on in Georgia in this connection, and also another major news story coming out of Fulton County just this past week. Stay with us for that all-important discussion. And we are back in this last segment of our first hour here on Morning Canollis, talking now about the latest developments just this past week coming out of Fulton County, Georgia, in particular. This important decision, a procedural decision, affirming what needed to happen under the rule of law, finding that indeed the motion of the former Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, to move his case from state court into federal court should be denied. The point about this is there was no significant question here. This is not a close question. The judge did what he needed to do, entertained the arguments, both oral and written, and came to the conclusion that indeed Mark Meadows' petition was unfounded, no basis upon which to do this at all, sending the message not only to him that he will remain in state court, but there are others who likewise want to follow that road as well. They have less compelling cases that even Mark Meadows did. Unlikely, highly unlikely, we'll go out on a limb here and even predict impossible to believe that anybody is going to be successful in petitioning this federal district court or another court to get that case moved from state court into federal court. And that underscores a larger issue here, which is an awful lot of this is in the category of absurd. This is stuff that's sort of beyond the pale when it comes to arguments that are legitimate, which the federal district courts, the state courts should entertain on a regular basis. This is not one of them. And I think it's important for all of us to appreciate that. We see more and more in some of the litigation going on this notion that all of these absurd principles and these arguments indeed should get a full exposure and a full exposition in the courts, but nonetheless they're premised upon absolutely positively baseless theories. We saw this past year or so when the Supreme Court entertained the notion that state courts have no involvement in deciding voting disputes, that involving a case called Moore versus Harper. You remember this well. We talked about this a lot. The independent state legislature theory, again, a crazy theory, a theory that is not at all supported by the Constitution, by any legal principles, and yet it's advanced and it receives its day in court, as it should, given what our courts are required to do. But the long-lasting, the residual concern that I and others have about this is it tends to send this message that all of these unsupported, completely ridiculous theories have some weight to them. And this is just a matter of judges weighing and sifting to determine whether or not indeed these particular positions should be advanced. Here, you're not even close. You're not even close. And America needs to understand that this is not one of those petitions. When it comes to things like guilt and innocence, absolutely. That's the ultimate decision that a jury will make as to all 19. Decisions about what evidence comes in and what doesn't come in, all of that, incredibly important. And those are material, and there can be reasonable people arguing about reasonable positions on those, and reasonable people can even disagree. That's why we have judges in the end to make those determinations. But more and more in America, in our courts, we've got these advocates, we've got lawyers, yes, indeed, we've got parties, including the former president, and including others, articulating positions in our federal and state courts that have no basis in law and in fact at all. And it's important to label them as such. And when we engage in discussions, as we do here on this broadcast and in private and in personal discussions, individual discussions, group discussions, important to identify those things about which reasonable people can disagree and which there can be disputes and those that are not. This, once again, this past week, not a close question. A reason to appreciate and embrace the rule of law, not necessarily a reason to celebrate anything here, because it simply confirms that, yes, indeed, the sun rises in the east, as indeed it continues to do. Mark Meadows told this past week his petition is without any merit, and he remains in state court, as do others. A significant other issue coming out, again, out of Fulton County just this past week, and that is this release by the court there of the transcript, the records, the report of the investigative grand jury that was doing all this work last year and times before that to determine what happened in Georgia. You may recall well that this investigative grand jury was looking at great numbers of witnesses. 75 witnesses altogether came before the grand jury there in Fulton County, describing various things that happened, much of which, not all of which, but much of which made its way into the indictment issued ultimately by an indicting grand jury, a second grand jury in Fulton County. And that's the predicate, that's the document that we now see in the state court there that Fani Willis is prosecuting. But just this past week, this final report of the investigative grand jury was unsealed by a judge on Friday, just yesterday. And the panel, interestingly, as a result of the disclosure of this information, this report coming out of this investigative grand jury's work, found that there were a number of people, almost 20 or so, that were not indicted by the investigative grand jury, who were recommended for indictment by the investigative grand jury, not indicted by the indicting grand jury. And among those people, Senator Lindsey Graham, for his entreaties, his engagement with some folks in Georgia, and also former Senators David Perdue, Kelly Loeffler, others in Georgia, Michael Flynn, the former National Security Advisor. All of these folks, again, described in this report for their involvement in matters related to trying to undermine the vote as it was taking place in Georgia. Now, why is this significant? Why is this also a rule of law issue to understand in our continuing work on civics here on Morning Canollis? Well, it's important because it not only describes what the process there in Georgia is, that is, its investigative grand jury, during this very expansive focus on all these things that happened, including the involvement of something in excess of 40 people altogether involved in this attempt to undermine the election, the voting there in Georgia. Important to understand that process and the way that the Georgia law works, because, again, we're all now in this national focus on the civics of our nation, including the state of Georgia, but also important to note what the grand jury there did. The indicting grand jury accepts and reviews and takes this investigative report from the investigative grand jury and chooses in its discretion not to indict everyone who's recommended. Now, what are the reasons for that? What could be going on here? A number of different things also to be understood as we try to make sense of what's going on in Georgia. We know that 19 of those 40 people were indeed indicted. That includes the former president and many other people, Mark Meadows among them. But we also know that many people, including some of the false electors, others involved, these former federal senators, Senator Lindsey Graham, Michael Flynn, some of the other Trump-aligned lawyers, Cleta Mitchell, Lynn Wood, all those folks also not indicted. probably by virtue of exercises of discretion by the prosecutor, Fani Willis, there. She has a great responsibility, not only in terms of organizing the investigation, presenting it to an investigative and then indicting grand jury, but also making discretionary decisions in her role as the prosecutor. And we come back in our second hour here on Morning Canollis. We're going to talk more about the role of a prosecutor, because this story this past week raises that issue, identifies yet another thing to understand about civics in America, the role of the grand juries, the role of prosecutors, and the discretion necessarily exercised by prosecutors to ensure that the rule of law is advanced. Stay with us for that second hour coming up right after this break.
It's my own downfall.
Welcome. Grab your favorite morning beverage and join us for Morning Canollis with Jim Santel.
You don't know me, but I'm your brother.
Sampling the news desserts of the week, here is your host, Jim Santel.
Welcome back to this, our second hour on Morning Canollis. It is Saturday, September 9th, 2023. Delighted to have you join me and Anya this morning as we talk about more important issues in the areas of law and government and the aspiration for justice in America. Right before the top of the hour break, we're talking about, once again, Georgia and the 19 defendant indictment coming out of Fulton County there. Some specifically important things having to do with where that case is going to be tried, with least respect to the former chief of staff. We talked in the previous hour about the decision made by a federal district court judge, an appropriate, right decision under the rule of law, that the case needs to stay in federal court and in a state court and not be removed to federal court, as Mark Meadows wanted it to do. And sending the message as well to others who might seek the same remedy, they will not be successful in doing that. And right during the course of the last few moments of our previous hour, then chatting about this other major news coming out of Fulton County. That is the release by a state court judge there. His name is Robert McBurney of the Fulton County Superior Court, of the report, a 9-page report by an investigative grand jury that, again, interviewed about actually 75 different witnesses during the course of the past year and a half or so, focusing on what they did to try to undermine the election in Georgia and compromise the votes that were properly cast there. And the findings of this report coming out of the investigative process here, that among the recommendations for people to be indicted that were not indicted, including Lindsey Graham, a senator from South Carolina, a neighboring state there, 2 former senators, David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler, Michael Flynn, the former national security advisor, a couple of Trump-aligned lawyers named Cleta Mitchell, Lynn Wood, others also in that category. And so the question is, what's going on here? Why is it the investigative grand jury makes these findings, and then the indicting grand jury, again, 2 different grand juries here, makes a decision not to indict as recommended by the investigative grand jury here? So the answer is a number of different possibilities. Number one, it may well be, especially when it comes to some of the specifics of some of these folks, that they may in fact have been granted immunity. Maybe they're involved with some cooperation already with Fani Willis. We know it was a long time between the return of that investigative grand jury report and the indicting grand jury returning its indictment itself. Maybe that some of those people, some of the 20 or so who are out there, are cooperating. And under those circumstances, they could be charged down the road. But right now, they're not in a contested position with the DA there. And for that reason, not the subject of an indictment here. Could also be that under the description of offense conduct set forth in the indicting grand jury, undeniably authored, recommended to the indicting grand jury by Fani Willis, that the RICO description may not have applied to everybody. We don't know exactly what the evidence is as to those other people not indicted. All sorts of strategic reasons. Could very well be that down the road, Fani Willis, like Jack Smith in the federal cases, could also indict other people in yet another indictment. No doubt all those things are perhaps on the list of options that she may have down the road, but a number of different explanations for why it is we've got an investigative grand jury recommending the indictments of individuals who are not, in fact, indicted in the end. It means, in effect, that the process works, and that's the point of this discussion. It means two things. One is you've got an indicting grand jury that is looking at these things and exercising its judgment, its discretion, which is exactly what you want a grand jury to do, to win and sift. I have said on this broadcast in the past that I happen to be an assistant U.S. attorney for many, many years, and on several occasions, the grand jury, a federal grand jury in eastern Wisconsin, came back to me and said, you know what, Mr. Santel, we're not indicting these individuals. We do not concur that there is probable cause or there's a basis upon which to return an indictment. And again, that's an affirmation of the way the system works. I would offer, again, as an understanding of what's happening in Georgia, to those people who would say that this is a process that railroads or it's a witch hunt, just the opposite. And the fact that you've got this disagreement, if you will, at least a difference of numbers in the number of people recommended to be indicted and those indicted, that the system works. It means you've got people, not prosecutors, not investigators, who are looking at this and saying, we're going to indict these, we're not going to indict these others. And then, as I've indicated, you also have a prosecutor, a state court prosecutor, who's also exercising discretion not to charge everybody with everything. That, too, is a part of the all-important assignment given to responsible people. We talked about that theory, that concept at the top of the first hour. People who are in responsible positions required to exercise their judgment, their discretion in a responsible way. I would offer that what we're seeing here coming out of that report is the system working, and a great refutation, not only by the Judge Jones in saying in the federal court that there's no there when it comes to bringing this case into federal court. There's also, by virtue of this release of the investigative report, there's an affirmation that the system is working, and that Americans across the political aisles should look at this and say, this is not political animus, this is not political animation. This is, in fact, a process that works, and indeed, that's what these reports, that's what's coming out of Georgia this past week, affirm with great clarity. Now, we have got, as always, this hour, some callers calling in. We appreciate your phone calls at 844-967-2789. You can also text Anya and me, and you can just simply go on the website, the Civic Media website, find your radio station, pull down the Morning Canollis file, and text us. We've already got a wonderful text, which I'll get back to in just a moment or so, and we've got a couple of callers on the line about some of our discussion, presumably already this morning. We're going to take those phone calls right at the top of this hour as well. Joe from Madison. Joe, glad to have you with us this morning. Your comment or question or observation about our commentary today.
Thanks again for all the information, particularly about the case in Alabama. And I'm sorry if I sound stupid or ignorant here, or that I wasn't listening carefully, but I guess I'm surprised, and I don't quite understand why the Supreme Court would involve itself what they did in the case in Alabama that had to do with gerrymandering, but did not participate or chose not to participate in the case about gerrymandering in the state of Wisconsin. I believe it was called Gill v. Whitford, which was the one that was looking at packing and packing and packing. That is a methodology that was used in saving on that.
And Joe, Joe, if I can interrupt, I'm having a great deal of difficulty hearing you. I know you're making some reference to Alabama, but for some reason the line is a little bit garbled right now. And I'm wondering if I will take you right back up. I wonder if you might be able to either call in or again, so we can get a more clarification. I think I'm following you, but I want to be very, very precise. So I'm wondering if you could call back in, and we'll get you back on the line and get your question articulated with great clarity. Anya's also indicating we'll keep you on that list here and get your question back here in just a moment or so. Joe, thanks so much for that. And in the meantime, Mark also calling in this morning with a comment or question.
Yeah, thanks, James. Looking at the Alabama, the case down in Georgia, and then also the other news coming out of Michigan, where apparently one of the Michigan fake electors was actually caught in a interview back in 2020. This is during December, right after they committed the fraud, signed off on those fake documents. They hope to get to the vice president that she admitted coordination with people working for the Trump campaign, and I just can't help but think that here in the state of Wisconsin there was similar connections there, that and the hesitancy, the reticence of our state attorney general to actually open an investigation on this, especially it should be a grand jury investigation as well, because to start interviewing these people to see what contacts were made between these people and how many other people were involved in this whole thing, because it just, going back to my early career, when I first got hired by the state of Wisconsin, I spent a good amount of time reading the Code of Ethics for state employees and had to apply that during my career, and none of these people that apparently signed off on this fake electors thing actually paid attention to, and not only the law, but also the Code of Ethics and the implied duty you have to uphold both the letter and the spirit of the law and the Constitution. And that it's just remarkable to me that you see all the inconsistencies that are evident here now in the state of Wisconsin. I saw today an article where Sam Alito was smacking back at Congress for talking about instituting ethical rule standards for the Supreme Court, while at the same time where something that was not an ethical violation on the part of candidate pro se, which is apparently the Republicans in our legislature are going to hold that against her and bringing up a pretty much phony impeachment here. Impeachment, what's simply to hold off the implementation of a letter of the law interpretation of our Constitution when it comes to voting districts.
Lots and lots of things to unpack there, Mark. As always, appreciate your comments and observations. I'll indicate that one of these broadcasts, we are going to get back to the Supreme Court. Indeed, there was some additional news coming out of the United States Supreme Court with respect to Sam Alito and a demand, if you will, by lots of folks in Washington, D.C., including the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, that he recuse himself in connection with a tax-related case, a wealth case, in which one of the attorneys petitioning before him, arguing case before him, was also involved in some interviews that the Associate Justice engaged in. That kind of thing, once again, underscores the broad issue I think that you're making, Mark, which is ethics, and the need not only for an ethics code before the United States Supreme Court. We've got some indication that some of the justices now are talking and saying that maybe something is in the works here, but we haven't seen that yet. That issue, however, spans beyond just the United States Supreme Court, as important as that is, and applies to everybody. Again, as I indicated at the top of our first hour, and again right now, the notion that your decisions on behalf of the people that you represent are all important. You've got to be guided by a set of rules and regulations that ensure integrity, that ensure focus on the rule of law, and that all of those kinds of things are animating you every single day of your work. Mark also indicated, of course, we've got this fake electors issue, and hopefully we'll get back to that as well, not only here in the state of Wisconsin, where to this date, our state attorney general has indicated that there may or may not be an investigation going on, but we know that not only in Michigan, but also, as Mark, you indicated, but also in Georgia, by virtue of the Fani Willis and the grand jury indictment there, you've got electors who have been charged with engaging in state law violations in Georgia and Michigan, raising issues about other fake electors around the country, likewise, who could be the subject of state prosecutions here in the state of Wisconsin, and also in the federal system as well. Let's not forget that, too. Entirely possible that a future indictment could focus on that as well. When we come back, we'll talk about more of those kinds of issues and others right here on Morning Canollis. And we are back. We're talking this morning, as always, about law, justice, and the aspiration for that justice here in the state of Wisconsin and in America. Some great calls, some great comments also on text coming in here through the studios of Civic Media, and focusing on some of those as well, following up on the call that Mark just made placed to us, and focusing in particular upon justice for all those people who might be involved. I want to note that Wes, likewise, affirming that notion that other people who tried to undermine our votes here in Wisconsin should get to face a little justice, as Wes describes it in his text as well. Concur entirely. Nothing that prevents the federal government, Jack Smith, in his future indictments, and those are coming as well, from charging federally false electors and other people involved here in the state of Wisconsin, and certainly in Georgia and Michigan, Arizona, Pennsylvania, the other states likewise involved in this kind of a criminal effort. Nothing that prevents the federal government, the Department of Justice, from indicting, and likely that will happen at some point down the road. But I would offer, in connection with Mark's good comment and Wes's comment as well, that there are also some state rights to be vindicated here as well. And that's why Fani Willis has brought those charges against many, not all of the false electors there. That's why the Attorney General in the state of Michigan, Mark just made reference to that as well, also bringing charges against the people there, and offer that indeed, to the extent that the facts support it and the law support it, and it does for the most part, every single state in the United States of America has false statements charges and the kinds of things that can in fact prohibit precisely what happened here with respect to the fake electors. Probably at the time of the passage by the legislature of the statutory prohibitions on false statements and false claims and misrepresenting things to government, didn't anticipate false electors, people putting together false documents purporting to be things that they are not. Nonetheless, again, that's what discretion of prosecutors is all about. It's identifying what the nature of the conduct has been, doing the investigation through a grand jury or separate from a grand jury, and then determining whether the existing law does in fact prohibit the conduct that has been identified. That's what the process of a prosecutor is all about. That's what's happening. That's what's happening in Georgia. That's what's happening in Michigan, and I'd offer as well that's what's happening in the office of the special counsel Jack Smith. Should also be happening, to Wes's good point, to Mark's good point, here in the state of Wisconsin, as you vindicate state interests as well that are sometimes similar to and even parallel to federal interests, but can be different. And that's what's going on, at least today, to this time, in Michigan and also in Georgia. So concur entirely on those good points Wes and Mark made about those kinds of prosecutions going on in the state system as well. Also had a reference by Dana, likewise, texting in about our prior discussion involving this Alabama matter, and in particular the decision by this 3-judge panel that we talked about in our first hour, finding that the Alabama legislature had once again violated Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, now directing that a special master and a cartographer put together drawing lines in the state of Alabama to ensure that federal elections and state elections are consistent with the law. And Dana in particular noted, as did the United States Supreme Court, and again the 3-judge panel just this past week, that there are seven districts altogether. 28%, well, actually a little bit more than that. 28% of the Alabama population is black, people of color there. And so Mark does some math here and says, gosh, 28% is a lot closer to 30 than 20. Why shouldn't they, that is frankly, everyone in the state of Alabama, but in particular focusing on people of color, get 3 districts versus 2 in Alabama? Dana makes that good math commentary. Plainly, I'll let Dana and others do the math on that kind of a thing. But the focus, I think, Dana, of your good point is one district is nowhere near representation. 2 would approach that representation, and 3, if you did in fact create 3 districts that were majority black, that would also not only be enhancing the Voting Rights Act of the 1960s, but also ensuring that people have access. And so very good points made all around. Always appreciating your phone calls on text and also by phone at 844-967-2789 if you can't get through, or as with respect to one of our callers, Joe, this past hour, if you have problems with respect to the clarity of the phone call, text us as well. We'd be delighted to engage with you in discussion through that process as well. Lots of things to talk about here this morning on Morning Canollis. Georgia, significant. Alabama, significant. And also some other things related to January 6th and the investigations and activities going on around the country. These are going to be fairly limited in nature, but it indicates, again, the amount of time and attention appropriately being given to people who engage in violations not only of our social norms, but actually of the law. You may recall well, as we commented last week, that Peter Navarro, this former economics advisor to the former President Donald Trump, going to trial just this past week for contempt of Congress. He was one of these several people who failed to provide information, cooperate in any manner with the House committee, the House Select Committee, established by former Speaker Nancy Pelosi to investigate the January 6th riot, the insurrection of that time. That committee looking at many, many people, talking to many people, lots of different documents, items for evidence presented to that committee. Among them, Peter Navarro. Why? Because even as an economics advisor, he had particular interest in the committee based upon his frequent television appearances at the time, in which he cast doubt on the election results and peddled this sort of a specious claim of voter fraud, just like his boss, the former president, was doing. So these January 6th committee had subpoenaed him. Peter Navarro had said, nope, I'm not cooperating as well, raising the issue that his boss, the former president, had directed him not to cooperate, raising in particular the issue of executive privilege, that he didn't have to provide that information because of that doctrine. The court last week, the district court judge who's presiding over the case, Judge Abin Mehta, finding that theory does not hold water. And indeed, this past week, after a couple of days of trial and a few hours of deliberation, the trial jury finding that Peter Navarro is guilty of criminal contempt of Congress based upon his failure to appear pursuant to that grand jury subpoena. Steve Bannon, also a former strategist for Trump, as you may recall, likewise convicted of the same offense last year. Right now, he's facing 4 months in prison, remains free on appeal. The sentencing for Peter Navarro coming up in January in front of Judge Mehta. When we come back, more information having to do with more people involved in January 6th, including John Eastman. Stay with us for that conversation.
And we're always streaming on TuneIn and the Civic Media app.
We're back here in Morning Canollis. Thank you for continuing to listen in. Also, as always, accepting your phone calls at 844-967-2789. Thrilled to have some engagements this morning, and also taking your texts. Again, through the auspices of Civic Media Online. Delighted to have that commentary and those questions presented as well. Right before the break, talking about some other players involved in the January 6th attempt to undermine the election. This conviction just this past week after a very brief jury deliberation of Peter Navarro, the former economics advisor to the former president. He now joins Steve Bannon, likewise convicted a number of months ago for the same offense, that is contempt of Congress and failure to participate in any way, to conform to show up for anything related to the investigation pursued previously by the House committee. Again, Steve Bannon facing 4 months in prison, free on appeal right now. Peter Navarro to be sentenced in January, probably, again, because these are misdemeanors, not receiving a huge amount of time, but nonetheless a part of the effort overall to ensure that the rule of law is advanced. Another story in that area. We know as well that the Congress had referred to the U.S. Department of Justice, others, including Mark Meadows, who arguably could have been prosecuted. Again, the exercise of discretion by prosecutors here not to indict Mark Meadows and perhaps other people for their failures to engage fully with the House committee. All of that, a part of what prosecutors do when it comes to weighing and sifting decisions about who to prosecute. Just because you can charge does not mean that you should. And there are all kinds of good and decent and rule of law based decisions that go into that process, all important to reaffirm. In connection with a judicial process, a quasi-judicial process going on in California, we also know this past week that John Eastman is also on trial with a small t. He's not in a federal court, he's not in a state court, but he's appearing in front of a district disciplinary panel, if you will, in the state of California. And who is John Eastman? Again, John Eastman among the 6 unindicted co-conspirators set forth in the federal indictment, alleging right now the single defendant, Donald Trump, engaging in 4 different counts of undermining the election, compromising, attempting to compromise the vote counting on January 6th. John Eastman identified among the people who worked with the former president in accomplishing those things, almost certainly going to be indicted in the federal system. John Eastman also indicted formally by name by the indicting grand jury through Fani Willis in Georgia. Lots and lots of things to keep track of. He's got lots of problems as well, as do other lawyers involved. You may recall well that people like Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell also facing disciplinary proceedings in various jurisdictions. Their licenses compromised by their involvement in advocacy for which they knew there was no support. And various panels now finding that because of their false statements, their misrepresentations, their advocacy without foundation, without an ethical base, the kind of thing that Mark was talking about before, that their licenses should be suspended, should be terminated. John Eastman in California, where he is licensed to practice law, facing debarment by a proceeding going on right now. He is testifying this past week, basically facing 11 disciplinary charges by the state court of California, stemming from this so-called legal strategy that he, along with a fellow named Ken Chesbro and others, designed in connection with the attempt to undermine the election. Many, many portions of Eastman's testimony this past week affirming from his own view that he doesn't recall making statements that the vice president, for example, could reject electoral votes as a part of this process. Doesn't recall various events that he allegedly was engaged in. Did not remember seeing a lot of the things that were reported in the national media, and saying along other things that he represented during the course of this proceeding. This administrative proceeding in California. He said it never said it was a viable option. That is to have the vice president declare that some of the electoral votes presented to him in the well of the Congress were simply invalid and sending the whole thing back to state. Said, I never did that. He said, given where we ended up on January 4th, I find it implausible that I would have made that statement. Well, a lot of the evidence indicates just the opposite. It's in part the reason why he has been named as an unindicted co-conspirator in the federal indictment, certainly focusing on Georgia. One of the reasons why he is named among the 19 who were indicted there in Georgia. The panel in California, again, it's not a criminal panel, it's not a formal civil panel, but does have the authority and responsibility to determine the future of John Eastman's law license, his license to practice law in the state of California, as there are similar panels in every state, including the state of Wisconsin. All of these panels now looking at what these lawyers did to further this scheme, alleged by the special counsel, Jack Smith, also alleged now by Fani Willis in the indictment coming out of Georgia. We'll keep on top of that one as well. We also know, speaking about Jack Smith, based upon a portion of a pleading released this past week, that Jack Smith continues to be hugely concerned about the conduct out there of the former president in making statements on Truth Social, being very, very public about criticism of him, criticism of the judge and the process in general. Again, this is not criticism that is a part of the natural, normal procedure here. This is not statements by a defendant, which under the First Amendment, under our rights to freedom of speech, you can go out there and say, you know what, I didn't do this. I find that the prosecution the defense against the prosecution will show that I did not, in fact, engage in this behavior. That's one thing, to maintain your innocence, which you've got a right to do, to maintain that you will present evidence in the course of the trial that will indicate that you're not, in fact, guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, as the prosecution may charge. This is different. And again, this past week, Jack Smith, as he and his colleagues have done before, raising as a part of a larger motion, most of which is under seal. We haven't seen all of that. But a portion of this indicates that Jack Smith, because of these continuing statements going after the judge, Judge Tanya Chutkan, and going after the prosecutor, and indicating the entire process is skewed, that is a witch hunt, the kinds of things that we've heard from Donald Trump all along, that those kinds of things now are threatening to prejudice the jury pool, the future jury pool that will be selected assembled, out of which the jury itself be selected, repeatedly warning the judge about this process that to ensure that the integrity of the system and encouraging some remedial action here. Undeniably, Judge Chutkan has already told the defendant here, Donald Trump, that she needs to ensure that his conduct is indeed consistent with the basic standards and practices. Trump, along the way, has used his platform to call Jack Smith, deranged, and sarcastically says that he's sure that Chutkan will be very fair. That kind of statement made about the judge. Those are the kinds of things that can be the subject of sanctions. And we have talked about that before, especially since Judge Chutkan, like the presiding judge in Georgia and other places around the country, judges do this all the time to ensure that the integrity of the process is promoted. The lesson here is that, like defense counsel, they're a very important role in ensuring that the government is put to its proof during the course of any presentation. The prosecution also has a very legitimate and compelling interest in ensuring that the process itself is legitimate and it's based upon a jury pool that's brought in that is fair and decent. It's not impacted by these kinds of statements. That's the kind of thing that Jack Smith is now re-articulating for Judge Chutkan, letting her know, as I'm sure she does, based upon her own review and her own exposure to the public media out there, that the engagements, public engagements, things said even as late as last night when the former president is in Iowa campaigning, suggesting once again that this process is something other than what it really is, which is a legitimate process to determine what happened. The presumption of innocence remains with the defendant, Donald Trump, in the federal system. It remains with all of those 19 in the state court in Georgia, brought by that investigating and now indicting grand jury, prosecuted by Fani Willis. All of that a part of the process that is legitimate, not the product of a witch hunt, not the product of things that the former president is articulating out there in the media. We will see what Judge Chutkan does, again, in response to this latest reminder, if you will, by the special counsel that Donald Trump continues to engage in this kind of inappropriate and counter to the basic rule of law principles approach when he is out there speaking publicly. We have talked today already about the involvement of individuals at the mid-level, at the highest level, at the lower levels as well. We know as well that many people involved in the assault on the Capitol, about 1,100, they continue to be identified, they continue to be charged, investigated, and sentenced by the federal district court in the U.S. District in the District of Columbia. And indeed, this past week, another major event involving some of those mid-level supervisors, managers, and organizers, this one involving Enrique Tarrio. Enrique Tarrio, the ex-leader of the Proud Boys. You may recall, based upon our discussion of last week, that we spent a lot of time talking about the imposition of his co-defendants who had been found guilty previously of seditious conspiracy, again, after a trial, before what? Before a trial jury in the District of Columbia. 4 of them found guilty, as was Enrique Tarrio. We talked last week about the fact that Ethan Nordine was given 18 years in prison based upon his conduct. Dominic Pizzola, the only one who was not found guilty of seditious conspiracy, given 10 years for his involvement in this conduct as well. And others, Joseph Biggs, 17 years in prison. Another key figure, Zachary Rell, giving 15 years. All extraordinary sentences under the federal guidelines. Interestingly, the judge imposing these sentences, Judge Timothy Kelly, not only finding that the enhancement under the guidelines for a terrorism conduct, domestic terrorism should apply, but believe it or not, even imposing these extraordinary sentences at levels that are below what the sentencing guidelines in the end would otherwise recommend. We know that the government in all these cases is recommending sometimes twice as much as these sentences are being doled out. Nonetheless, that's the process, again, that we embrace That is, judges make decisions about how long people should be sentenced in the federal system, the state system as well. This past week, again, a judge in the federal district court in the District of Columbia, imposing another sentence upon the fifth member of the Proud Boys. His name, once again, Enrique Tarrio, the former leader of the Proud Boys, sentenced to 22 years. 22 years in prison for his very central role in organizing this gang, this group of pro-Trump followers to attack the Capitol on January 6th of 21 and to stop the peaceful transfer of presidential power on that day. Interestingly, the evidence at trial indicated that unlike these other four defendants, again now sentenced to slightly lesser terms in federal prison, Enrique Tarrio not present in Washington, D.C. on that day. He was there the night before. A lot of the evidence presented during the course of the trial against him, confirming what he said, confirming as the events took place later on January 6th that we did this, we accomplished this, is what he's saying, taking responsibility for it. But Enrique Tarrio himself in the Baltimore area, based upon directives that he not be in Washington, D.C., based upon some other conduct, some other criminal conduct in which he was engaged. In any event, the judge this past week finding once again that the terrorism, domestic terrorism enhancement applies, that it was indeed by Enrique Tarrio a seditious conspiracy, an instance of domestic terrorism, and sentencing Enrique Tarrio to 22 years. That is the highest sentence imposed to date on anyone, including the excess of 1,000 people charged already, many of them getting much lower sentences, many of them getting sentences in the single-digit range, and as we know as well, in the double-digit range. Enrique Tarrio this past week getting 22 years in prison, the most severe sentence imposed to date. We know that Stuart Rhodes, the head of another group, they're the Oath Keepers, he getting 18 years in prison, 22 years imposed upon Enrique Tarrio. When we come back, a description and an examination of why that's important, why it's significant to promote the rule of law, and why it is that this happened this past week in the Federal District Court in the District of Columbia. Stay with us for that discussion.
To me, who's a blonde stranger, lives by the sea. Blonde stranger, lives by the sea.
Welcome back. This is our final segment on this Saturday, September 9th, 2023. Morning Canollis talking about the imposition of the most severe sentence imposed upon anyone involved in the January 6th sedition. That sentence imposed by Judge Timothy Kelly, a federal district court judge in the District of Columbia, imposing a 22-year sentence upon Enrique Tarrio, the former leader of the Proud Boys, finding that this was not only a serious offense, according to Timothy Kelly, adding this domestic terrorism enhancement, and describing Tarrio as the ultimate leader of the conspiracy motivated by a revolutionary zeal. That's words from the district court judge imposing sentence. Interestingly, in what seemed like testimony that Tarrio never gave at trial, he told Judge Kelly that after the election, he could simply not believe that Donald Trump had lost, and that every media outlet he turned to told him that his anger was justified. That was his description to the imposing judge this past week. And after two pro-Trump rallies in Washington before January 6th, he went on again, all this description to the judge. He said he saw the temperature rising among his followers and claimed that he reached out to officials in the FBI, the Secret Service, and the local Washington police. And as for January 6th, however, he said that it was a national embarrassment. Mr. Tarrio, now saying it's a national embarrassment, said, "I am not a political zealot." Like his mother, who also testified, asking for leniency, Tarrio likewise asking for leniency in this case. As he left the courtroom, escorted by federal marshals, Tarrio raised two fingers in a peace or a victory sign. That happened again this past week in the federal district court in front of Judge Timothy Kelly. 22 years against people who were involved in organizing, directing. No indication that Tarrio himself, of course, was in the Capitol engaging the violent conduct, but receiving the strongest sentence. Why? By virtue of the conspiracy that he put together with himself and others. That's the nature of a conspiracy to undermine what happened, what was going to happen, trying to undermine what was going to happen on January 6th, and accomplishing it in a way that compromised the very nature of who we are as a nation. That's the reason why Judge Kelly said that you are at the core of this revolutionary zeal, and that's the reason why he gets 22 years in prison. Again, nowhere near what the government had requested, focusing upon the impact that you can have even as a supervisor and organizer in doing these kinds of things. A very significant sentence. We will see what happens to other people, again, among the excess of thousands of people already charged, awaiting sentencing in this process overall. We'll see what happens, again, not only to the former president, now charged in the federal system, and also in the state system as well. All of that coming up as we go ahead with our further examination, our discussion of that. Promise as well down the road to return to that federal indictment. I want to talk in great detail, do a deeper dive into some of the specific allegations that are also a part of that indictment coming out of the federal system that focuses upon the way in which the Department of Justice, through a former senior leader named Jeffrey Clark, the attempts to try to undermine the work, the mission of the Department of Justice in accomplishing that, and then also the involvement of the attempt to involve the former vice president. All of that set forth in that indictment as well. We'll get back to that in a future broadcast to further describe the nature of these charges. Again, affirming always that defendants are presumed innocent until proven guilty, but showing in depth and detail the nature of the charges that are pending right now against the former president. As we head into our last minute, we do have another caller, Kevin, calling in from Appleton. Kevin, glad to have you with us this morning.
Hi, good morning.
Glad to have you with us, Kevin.
Yes, thank you for taking my call. Do you think if Trump becomes president, if he does, would he pardon those folks that were sentenced?
Kevin, great question, and let me answer it as directly as you've stated it. Not only based upon the authority of a president, but also upon what Donald Trump himself has said out there. He plainly continues in social media and publicly rallies those kinds of things to say that he views all of these prosecutions as illegitimate. He describes a lot of the people who are involved in the January 6th on-the-ground insurrection. Probably anybody who's even touched this, certainly the people around him, the unindicted co-conspirators in the indictment that he is facing, the other 18 in Georgia. He regards all of this as a witch hunt, as foundationless and the product of political animus. Highly anticipating that if he does become president, he would pardon those who are charged in the federal system and who have been the subject of prosecutions already. Could also pardon people who have not been charged. Significantly, to answer your very good question, the reason why the state prosecution in Georgia, state prosecutions that may come in Michigan, certainly the New York prosecution, the criminal prosecution there, not for January 6th, is also a very important prosecution, is because those are not subject to a federal pardon by a federal president, but he could do it. And as we've talked before, under our Constitution, written by James Madison, adopted by our states, the power of the president to impose pardons on people is in fact plenary. It's very, very broad, and he could do that highly likely. Can't predict with certainty, but highly likely if Donald Trump does become the next president of the United States of America, that he will establish a process and will grant pardons to all of these folks who have been the subject of these prosecutions. Importantly, there's a wonderful Supreme Court case out there that Jerry Ford carried around in his pocket ever since, throughout his entire life, certainly to the term of his presidency, that says that whenever you accept a pardon, you're acknowledging guilt. And that's something that's also a part of our jurisprudence The Supreme Court has said just that. But to your very good question, yes, indeed, the president does have the power to not only confer pardons upon individuals who are out there, convicted, sentenced, charged, appeals can in fact be exhausted, and can also, as Jerry Ford did with Richard Nixon, grant a pardon for conduct not yet charged, not yet the subject of litigation. So again, one more reason to think long and hard about what happens in about 14 months from now when we elect the next president and determine what America means for us in the rule of law. As we close today, I want to also acknowledge that we've been playing today the wonderful music of Jimmy Buffett. And we know that Jimmy Buffett was lost to all of us, a great artist in America just about a week or so ago. As we leave today playing the release from the Jimmy Buffett group of songs released posthumously in celebration of his life and the artistry that he brings to America. We recognize not only that he is lost to us, but that his legacy endures musically and in terms of artistry throughout our nation. Join us again next week for more discussion, not only of the rule of law, justice, and government, but also about ways in which we can all become involved in ensuring that America remains the country that enforces, that observes, and exalts the rule of law in all that we do. Thanks for joining me this morning. Have a good week, everybody. Take care.
Bubble